morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning for the kickoff of the Safe Water for All campaign. My name is Sarah White. I'm the Communications Director for the Wisconsin DNR. Speaking today are Preston Cole, DNR Secretary, Karen Timberlake, DHS Secretary Designee, Todd Ames, DNR Deputy Secretary, Jill Zelmer, DNR's Environmental Management Division Deputy Administrator, Mimi Johnson, DNR's Office of Emerging Contaminants Director, and John Myman, DHS Chief Medical Officer. And with that, I will turn it over to Secretary Cole.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for listening in. This is another opportunity to keep in front of Wisconsinites and all those who visit Wisconsin that we are still dealing with issues of clean water in the state of Wisconsin. It's troubling at this stage of the game, while we're still fighting a pandemic that has seen a resurgence, that there are still communities across the state of Wisconsin that are encumbered by lead laterals, PFAS in the water, as well as nitrates. And it's something that we want to make sure we keep in front of the public to know where they can get information relative to the water in their own neighborhoods. And that said, we want our folks in the public to be part of this process. Ask the tough questions of your leadership in your cities, towns, and village, and also ask tough questions of the Department of Natural Resources and Department of Health Services. We lean in very heavily with Secretary Designee Timberlake because these folks give us the intel that we need to create these MCLs, these maximum contaminant limits. And the human health circumstances is concerning to all of us. But we are in good hands, not with Allstate, but with the Department of Health Services. And so, Secretary Designee, thank you for you and your team's work at every stage of the game and being able to determine that, yes, nitrates create blue baby syndromes in our rural communities. And yes, PFAS have legacy issues over time. And I'll just remind this group that Josh Call, myself, DNR team, and certainly the state's attorney all visited the North Woods. We went to Marinette, had a 2-day listening session, and if folks weren't crying at the microphone, they were upset. And the reason that they were crying and upset that they have lost a legacy of relatives to testicular cancer, thoracic cancer, and they didn't know what was going on. And so what the department and DHS was able to do was connect the dots. Hell, there's a movie out there right now that talks about PFAS in the water. That should tell everybody something about this chemical. And our responsibility is to work with industry to make sure that people are accountable. And our responsibility is to work with industry, to work with cities, towns, and villages so that they too can live their true dreams out with clean water. And that said, the idea of the year of clean drinking water for the governor, and he'll be the first to tell you, Governor Evers will tell you that it is always the year of clean drinking water. It will never go away. It will go away under his leadership, and we are so thankful for that. And so the PFAS Action Council is in play. We have a number of lead laterals. About 108, 110 communities around the state of Wisconsin have lead laterals. There is no safe level of lead. And we know in some of our older cities, they're also encumbered by lead paint and lead laterals. That's a double whammy on a family. So we have a responsibility to protect human health and the public around these issues. Now, nitrates in water, in our drinking water, is also a challenge. Creates circumstances of, again, blue baby syndrome. We'll be continuing to work with our ag producers because these are our first stewards. They too understand the implications of too much nitrogen in the water. There's several lakes around, tributaries around the state of Wisconsin that have blue-green algae, which is a precursor for nitrates in the water. We know that safe water in rural Wisconsin is equally as important as our cities, towns, and villages. And so we want to be able to work with our ag community so that we can lay down the gauntlet to protect human health. And they will be part of the processes that we put in play relative to clean water. We cannot do it alone. We have to count on the ag community and the producers to ensure that they too can see a vital end to too much nitrogen in our water. And before I turn it over to Secretary Timberlake, I will let folks know that the department is in good hands. You know, Todd, being the number 2 to the department, also ran the water section for the Department of Natural Resources. How lucky are we to have his leadership at a high level and be an advisor to myself as well as the governor and the legislature around clean water. So Todd, thank you and your team for your constant voice on clean water, because you do have a constant voice on clean water. With that said, I'm happy to turn the microphone over to Secretary-designee Timberlake. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Secretary Cole, and thank you for having us here to this important event. We really appreciate your leadership and that of Governor Evers in continuing to lift up and prioritize clean drinking water as an essential element to health and well-being all across our state. What I want to do this morning is just say a couple of brief words about the health effects that we at the Department of Health Services really pay attention to and watch for when it comes to drinking water. My colleague, Dr. John Myman, who is the Chief Medical Officer in our Bureau of Environmental and Occupational Health within our Division of Public Health, will give you even more of the details. But just, from our perspective, folks, of course, know the Department of Health Services for our work in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I want you to understand is that as the state's health agency, as the agency whose mission is to protect and promote the health and safety of all people in the state of Wisconsin, we can't do that if we don't pay attention to all of the drivers of good health as well as challenges and potential harmful effects on health. And certainly contaminated drinking water is a critical risk factor that we want to continue to pay attention to. Among the things that we do at the Department of Health Services, and certainly Secretary Cole gave you a sneak preview of this, we certainly work with both our state agency partners as well as our local public health partners in understanding health hazards when they emerge, in helping to support investigations of those hazards, in looking at outbreaks and illness investigations. We understand that we need to pay attention not only to waterborne communicable diseases, but those factors that are more kind of endemic in the water supply and that can lead to the impacts on human health that the Secretary already talked about. We also know that natural disasters like flooding can create challenges for human health, and so that is also something that we are often called upon to respond to and to help investigate. As the Secretary noted, we work collaboratively with the Department of Natural Resources and with our partners at the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection as well to look at the establishment of science-based and evidence-based standards that can help all of us guide our decision-making when it comes to health effects and acceptable limits of different kinds of potential contaminants in water. In addition, we help on that regulatory side. We help on the public education and awareness side of things. There are really terrific resources on our website that relate to nitrate, that relate to PFAS, that relate to lead in water, and I would encourage everyone to check those out because there are real steps that each of us can take to understand our potential risk, to mitigate and manage that risk and ensure that we and our family members and our loved ones are as safe as we can be. We also provide direct consultation to state agency partners, local public health partners, water utilities, and certainly even members of the general public. So this is a wide-ranging, complex set of issues. It requires a wide-ranging, collaborative, coordinated response, and that's really what we all are here to talk about and to demonstrate today. If I could amplify just a couple of quick points on each of the focus areas that we're really going to talk about today. Again, as Secretary Cole noted, nitrate contamination is associated with serious health effects. It can be a contributing factor to birth defects, to thyroid disease, even to diseases like colon cancer that are so unfortunately common. What we know is that about 10% of our private wells in Wisconsin are known to have elevated levels of nitrate. And I think among our challenges is helping to reach people who rely on private well water who may not have had that well tested recently or at all, and may not be aware of what that risk is. So one of the things that we at the department can do in response is to support no-cost private well testing for nitrates so that we can help people who do rely on private wells as a source of drinking water to understand what their risk may be and what they can do about it. In terms of lead, I think that the risks of lead exposure are well known and well understood. I really want to amplify Secretary Cole's points, though, that there is no safe exposure level to lead. Lead is a particularly harmful contaminant for young children and the developing brains of young children. While we at the department do spend the majority of our time and energy making sure people understand that the major contributor to lead poisoning in children is lead paint, lead-based paint in older homes, it is also true that lead that is found in drinking water can be a risk factor, certainly, to children and to families. Lead can come from the faucet itself, it can come from the pipes that feed the faucet, it can come from the service lines that feed the pipes that feed the faucet, and it can even be found in private wells. So similar to the nitrate conversation, it's really important for people to understand what those risk factors are and to understand that there are things that can be done both to understand whether your water has lead, to understand that replacement of all of those components is important. There's obviously a critical role for government to play in helping to finance the replacement of some of that infrastructure that is just beyond what any individual homeowner or landlord is capable of doing. I know that we at the department have also been participating with child care centers around our state with our partners at the Department of Children and Families to make sure that where we have kids in child care settings, we're sure that that drinking water is safe for them. So lots more work to do there. And finally, you know, kind of the newer entrant onto the scene, the conversation that is taking up so much of our time appropriately is PFAS, you know, this group of man-made chemicals that have been used across many industries for decades. So this is, on the one hand, newer entrant in terms of our focus, on the other hand, really a legacy challenge and a long-standing concern. What we know about PFAS exposure is it can lead to elevated blood cholesterol, can lead to reduced antibody levels and impact our ability to fight infection, can also impact human fertility. So it has a wide array of potential health effects. What we have been doing of late with our partners again at the DNR and with DACCAP would be to help advise on where we need to issue caution and notices to people about avoiding PFAS in contaminated water, about reducing consumption of potentially contaminated fish or other kinds of wild game, as well as being aware of the potential for PFAS contamination in soil and what that means for crops that are grown in those conditions. We know that obviously the DNR has played a really critical leading role in providing bottled water where that has been necessary to people who have been relying on private wells that have been contaminated with PFAS. So there is a great deal of work to do to make sure that across Wisconsin, the beautiful and abundant water resources that we do have are safe, that they're safe for drinking, where that's how they're used, that they're safe for recreation, that they're safe for agriculture. And that's really the commitment of all of us here across state government that we're demonstrating today. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Secretary Cole, and to Sarah, who will tap our next presenter. Thank you.
Yes, we'll now go to Jim Zelmer. Oh, excuse me, Dr. Martin. My apologies.
Thanks. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk here a little bit today and kind of building on some of the messages that Secretary Timberlake talked about, really talk more about some of the health concerns that we have around these three contaminants, because the one thing that all three of them have in common is that unfortunately it's some of the most disadvantaged communities that can be most impacted by these. So I'd like to talk through kind of the major health impacts of each one, and also talk about ways that people at home that have concerns can protect their health as well. So as Secretary Timberlake and Secretary Cole already mentioned, lead has been a public health concern for many decades now. It's a very pervasive contaminant, and it's something that we know from decades of study that there's no safe level of lead. Any potential exposure can lead to harm. And this is a particular concern in children here in Wisconsin. So about every year as we test children for lead poisoning, we find about 5% of those children are lead poisoned. That accounts for about 4,000 children per year. The reason we're concerned is because when exposed at an early age, that lead can end up impacting development. So it can end up resulting in reduced academic achievement over time. And it can also end up resulting in impaired growth. So those exposure during those critical periods of development can really lead to lifelong health impacts. And the risks for adults are there as well. Women who are pregnant who are exposed during pregnancy may have decreased growth of the baby as well. So we know that lead-based paint is a major contributor to lead poisoning. We've done a number of things over the years to try to reduce that risk in homes across the state. But because lead can have impacts on health at even low levels, we really need to be comprehensive in our approach to addressing lead. And lead in water is yet another way that people can get exposed. Its use in a variety of plumbing components, particularly lead service lines, of which there are thousands across the state, can result in lead within the water. And that exposure is probably of greatest risk to young children, again, particularly infants that may be consuming formula made with that tap water as well. So at DHS and with DNR, we've really tried to address this comprehensively, both to address the root cause and to also provide help to communities to help assess the risk in their towns and their cities and their schools. And so for people who have concerns that they may live in an older home before 1986 that are concerned about lead in their plumbing, there are a number of simple steps if you own your home or even if you rent it that we provide, where we provide education both to local public health and to members of the public about some simple things they can do, from filtering water to addressing the root cause. So there are things people can do to protect their health. So moving to nitrate, just like lead, I think our concerns are also centered around the impacts particularly to young children. So as was mentioned, exposure in very young children who drink contaminated water that has been contaminated with nitrate can really lead to a rare but serious health condition called methemoglobinemia. And that results in an inability of the body to carry oxygen. And in extreme cases, it can result in hospitalization and very serious illness. And while thankfully that's very rare, we have had cases reported in the state over the past couple of decades. And the reason, of course, we're concerned is because nitrate contamination is so widespread here in the state, with about 10% of wells exceeding the standard. And then the health, of course, to adults as well can be impacted. Although the evidence is emerging around this, we do have evidence that it can, in fact, cause thyroid disease. And there is some emerging evidence as well that nitrate exposure among pregnant women can increase the risk of certain birth defects as well. So for homeowners that are in private water, we encourage everyone to test at least once a year for nitrate. And if you have a young child at the home, or if you're someone who is pregnant, we encourage testing more frequently than that. So again, to identify that and fix that issue as soon as possible. So lastly, just to touch on PFAS briefly, that will be, I think, discussed in greater detail by my colleagues from DNR. This is a particularly challenging and very complex issue. These are thousands of compounds that have been used for many decades. And although we often refer to them as emerging contaminants, we have learned a lot over the last 20 years about their potential impacts on health. And we're using that information to help make science-based recommendations for levels that are acceptable in drinking water. So PFAS, particularly the ones that are best studied, have been linked to a variety of health concerns. I think our primary concerns really around, as Secretary Timberlake mentioned, potential decreased response to vaccines. People may have lower levels of antibodies after receiving vaccinations if they've been exposed to some of these compounds. And that's a particular concern in children. And then as well as in older, in adults as well, there are some linkages with elevated blood pressure in pregnancy, problems with fertility, and potentially thyroid disease. So as we test more areas across the state, we continue to find more contaminated sites. And so we really encourage members of the public who are in one of these sites to make sure that they are using a safe source of water. If you're not, there are other things you can do. Another potential way that people get exposed is through consumption of fish. And so that's something that we put out guidance with our DNR colleagues every year to help guide people towards safe choices as well. So I wanted to kind of leave it at there. There's a very brief and high-level overview. I just want to reemphasize that all of these things are of significant concern to public health. Tackling these is going to require a lot of dedication, a lot of collaboration between partners over the coming years. But if we work together, we can make some lasting benefits to health. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it over.
Thank you. Now we'll go to Jim Zelman.
Thank you, Sarah. As Secretary Cole had stated, the governor's year of clean water shined a bright light on the challenges and solutions to protecting our water resources. We've completed several of the tasks listed in the governor's 2019 Year of Clean Drinking Water report, but there's a lot more work to do to ensure that Wisconsin's water resources are protected for future generations. Today we'll provide you with updates on activities we are taking to address contamination of lead, nitrate, and the growing concern with PFAS. We'll start out with lead. Lead is a toxic metal that's widespread in the environment, and people are exposed to lead in a variety of sources every day, including lead-based paint, food, drinking water, air, and soil. Drinking water can make up 20% or more of a person's total exposure to lead. This mainly occurs when water sits in the plumbing for an extended period of time, such as overnight. EPA set a goal for lead in drinking water at 0 because lead can be harmful to human health at low exposure levels. The best way to reduce exposure to lead in drinking water is to completely remove lead-containing pipes and fixtures from our drinking water systems. Next slide. So what are we doing about it? The drinking water regulations for lead have been in place for 30 years. We continue working with public water systems on testing and taking appropriate actions if lead levels are above the action level of 15 parts per billion. We recently expanded the eligibility under the state's revolving loan program to allow municipalities to use this money to also remove the privately owned lead service lines that are attached to the homes. $63 million was made available to remove lead service lines. Participation in the program has been very strong, with 67 municipalities applying for approximately $40 million in the first year of the program. Approximately 8,400 lead service lines will be replaced with this funding. Having said that, we still have a long way to go, with Wisconsin communities having well over 200,000 lead service lines. We continue working with municipalities to evaluate and optimize their programs to treat their water using certain chemicals to prevent lead from dissolving into the drinking water. This is an ongoing activity that will continue until all lead piping is removed from the water distribution systems. We also launched a statewide Get the Lead Out educational outreach program by sharing information with municipalities for what they can do to remove lead service lines and assisting them to identify funding sources. Next slide. So what more can be done? EPA is finishing up revisions to the federal lead in drinking water regulation. Secretary Cole was with the administrator of EPA just a couple weeks back over in Milwaukee for a listening session. We expect them to finalize the federal regulations soon. Once done, we'll immediately begin rulemaking to incorporate those regulations into our state, or requirements into our state regulations. Some of the improvements under the new regulation include requiring water systems to identify all lead service lines and make the locational information available to the public. Better protecting children by requiring testing in schools and child care facilities. Establishing a trigger level of 10 parts per billion to jumpstart mitigation earlier and in more communities. And finally, requiring complete replacement of lead service lines, both the public and privately owned portions of the water distribution piping. We need to pursue additional funding to complete lead service line replacement. The federal infrastructure bill includes the goal to eliminate all lead service lines in the country. Next slide. So what can people do to minimize their exposure to lead in drinking water? First, flush your tap to reduce potential exposure to lead from household lead plumbing. This is especially important when the water has been off and sitting in the pipes for more than 6 hours. Before filling your glass of water in the morning, flush your home's pipes by running the tap, taking a shower, doing laundry, or a load of dishes. Also, have your plumbing inspected and tested for lead. Since we can't see, taste, or smell lead dissolved in water, testing is the only sure way of telling whether there are harmful quantities of lead in our drinking water. If people do have a lead service line, use a point-of-use filter that's certified to reduce or eliminate lead for water they use for drinking and cooking. And then finally, learn more about the water that you're consuming. If you're served by a municipal water supply, please take time each year to take a look at the utility's annual consumer confidence report. It gives information on any contamination present in your water supply and actions that municipalities are taking. If your water comes from a private well or other private water supply, check with your local health department on information on exposure for lead, and also visit our website. Next slide. So now we'll switch gears to nitrate. Nitrate is Wisconsin's most widespread groundwater contaminant, and that contamination is increasing in severity and extent in some areas of intensive agriculture in the state. Common sources of nitrate include fertilizer, manure, septic systems, and wastewater. There's more than 800,000 private wells in Wisconsin serving drinking water needs of roughly a quarter of the state's population. Studies have shown that at least 10% of private wells in Wisconsin have nitrate concentration above the health standard of 10 parts per million. That estimate is most likely on the low side, since only about 10% of private well owners have tested their well water for nitrate. We also have approximately 300 public water supplies that exceed the public health standard for nitrate, and several other of our public water systems are seeing an increase in concentrations. As with lead, we can't see, taste, or smell nitrate in our water, so the only way to know whether our well water contains excessive levels of nitrate is by collecting a sample for laboratory testing. Next slide. So what are we doing about it? We revised the well construction requirements to better protect against contamination in geologically sensitive areas of the state. We're working on revising the nitrogen application standard to reduce the amount of nitrate entering Wisconsin's groundwater. In fact, we just announced yesterday a series of webinars that's focused on the science and economics to minimize nitrogen loss to groundwater. And finally, we're working with the University of Wisconsin system, Department of Ag, and NRCS to develop a fertilizer decision support tool to help agribusiness in their nutrient management planning. Next slide. What more can be done? We can expand the well compensation program to allow funding private well replacement where nitrate exceeds the health-based standard. Currently, to be eligible for this grant program, nitrate level has to be 4 times the health standard, or 40 parts per million. It also needs to provide water to livestock, and also there's a limit on family income of $65,000 or less. We could lower that to the health-based standard of 10 rather than the 40 parts per million, remove that requirement that it also serve livestock, and then also raise the family income threshold. Also provide funding to county health departments to expand testing of privately owned wells. Currently, as I mentioned, there's only about 10% of the private wells have been tested for nitrate. Increase funding to assist mapping of sensitive geologic areas in each county of the state. And then continue working with agribusiness, Department of Ag, NRCS, and the UW system to develop strategies to promote land use practices to protect groundwater from nitrate and other contaminants. Next slide. So in the meantime, what can individuals do to minimize their exposure to nitrate in drinking water? Test your private well for nitrate and bacteria every year. We recently held a free nitrate testing event at the Farm Tech Days in Eau Claire. Had over 200 people bring samples of their well water, and approximately 20% of those results were above the health standard. Our experts were there to answer questions and assist the well owners with the next steps. And finally, have their well checked to make sure it is properly constructed to prevent contamination from entering it, and also check their septic tank and drain field to make sure they're working properly. And with that, I'll pass it on to Mimi Johnson, who will update us on the progress made to address PFAS in Wisconsin. Mimi?
Great, thank you, Jim. Next slide. So as Dr. Myman and others have mentioned this morning, PFAS are a group of human-made chemicals that have been used for decades in many industrial and consumer products. They don't break down in the environment and have been discovered at concentrations of concern in groundwater, surface water, and drinking water. Some of the products that may contain PFAS include stain-resistant carpet and fabric, nonstick cookware, firefighting foam, and fast food packaging. And as we're discussing today, we may also be exposed through contaminated drinking water. PFAS are discharged into the environment from industrial and commercial facilities, from military bases, airports, fire stations, or anywhere that might use AFFF firefighting foam, and through waste products, including leachate from landfills and biosolids and effluent from wastewater treatment facilities. Next slide. So some of the work that we're doing in Wisconsin right now to address PFAS includes the Wisconsin PFAS Action Council, our multi-agency coordinating body, or WISPAC as we call it, which issued a PFAS action plan with a series of recommended actions and guiding principles. Using that, we've already started to implement some of those actions, and I'll talk a little bit about those now. So one of the key factors in addressing PFAS is knowing where it is in the state. We work across our agency to gather samples from throughout Wisconsin, and once we've gathered the data, we work in partnership with the Department of Health Services and others to assess the human health risk. And at times, that sampling data may result in consumption advisories or health advisories. We've sampled more than 100 water bodies for PFAS in surface water and 55 water bodies for PFAS contamination in fish. As a result of these sampling efforts, we've issued 17 fish consumption advisories for fish, including the first U.S.-issued advisory in a Great Lake for smelt and superior, and the first inland trout advisory. We're also committed to ensuring that everyone's water is safe to drink. We do this through working with our partners and sampling and analyzing the water, and then providing both short-term and long-term drinking water solutions. And to date, more than 90 municipal water systems in Wisconsin have been sampled for PFAS, and only about 5% of those have exceeded recommended health levels. We also work in coordination with our colleagues at the Department of Health Services to develop protective standards, as has been discussed this morning. And these include standards for groundwater, drinking water, and surface water. And these really aim to protect both Wisconsin residents and their health, as well as the health of our natural resources. These are driven by science and are iterative. And right now, we're currently in the promulgation of 2 different cycles of recommendation based on the science that's been reviewed both at the DNR and DHS. We recognize the real impact of PFAS contamination has on communities, and we've worked with our residents, community leaders, responsible parties, and other stakeholders to provide technical assistance to best identify, contain, and prevent contamination. But there's still more we can do. And the PFAS action plan, again, lays out several of those key actions, which include passing comprehensive legislation that would work to continue to identify, treat, and contain the PFAS, but would also support our communities, our airports, and our businesses to help prevent future contamination and to promote product stewardship and innovation. And this legislation also really invests in our capacity as a state to address this issue. We can provide state funds to communities. Communities need access to resources to help do their own sampling and monitoring, to do their own treatment and containment, and for their long-term solutions, both in reaction to sampling efforts, but also looking forward to prevent future contamination. We need to continue to sample to understand our footprint of PFAS in the state and to monitor how that footprint might be changing over time. This includes sampling fish and wildlife and sampling surface water and groundwater, as well as air, soil, and other media. We can act swiftly to enact limits, as the standards we talked about before that we're in the process of doing, to ensure that our drinking water is safe when you turn on the tap. And we must sample all of our public drinking water systems. We're one of very few states in the Midwest that has yet to sample our entire public water system, and this information is critical to our broader understanding of how and where PFAS is in Wisconsin. So what can you do as an individual? As Jim had mentioned, testing your water is the best way to determine if your drinking water is contaminated. The Department of Health Services is available to assist in interpreting your results of PFAS sampling as well. You can also visit our PFAS page on the Wisconsin DNR website. You'll find the latest information about sampling results, consumption or health advisories, and additional resources about PFAS. So now I will turn it over to Deputy Secretary Todd Eaves.
Thanks, Mimi. And thanks for everybody's comments this morning. As Secretary Cole mentioned, water, safe water, clean water is a passion of mine that has been the case for my entire career. I'm going to talk just briefly about, this is the beginning of a campaign that will continue for the next couple of months, and we'll talk a little bit about that toward the end, but I think it's important to put into context how we got here and why this sort of work is something that happens a lot in Wisconsin. Nearly 100 years ago, Aldo Leopold began to set the standard. He talked about the creation of a conservation commission, about having an approach to dealing with soil loss in the Driftless area in the Coon Valley, in addressing that in a way that was really cutting-edge natural resource management at the time. Fast forward a couple of decades, a guy named Gaylord Nelson, at the time the governor in the 1950s and into the 1960s, was talking about the importance of protecting our natural capital and how critical it is that we protect our environment at a time when other folks were just beginning to realize it was an issue. And of course, in 1970, when he came up with the brilliant idea to have an Earth Day, it was not only a national, but indeed a worldwide focus on the environmental challenges that we had that led to some amazing advancements, including in this country, passage of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, all things that we continue to rely on for protection of our natural resources. From there, the state of Wisconsin continued to take cutting-edge action on important environmental issues. First state in the nation to have comprehensive treatment of wastewater. In the early 1980s, we passed the groundwater quality law that is still today talked about as a model legislation for the country. We followed that with acid rain legislation, with one of the first states in the nation to place limits on the amount of phosphorus that could come out of pipe into our waterways, all the way up to the beginning of this century where we passed some of the best rules and regulations on polluted runoff, to coming from stormwater in urban areas, from construction sites, and certainly from agricultural lands. Here's the bottom line. In Wisconsin, we don't just talk about environmental problems. We solve them. And so over the next couple of months, we're not just going to be through a series of webinars and panel discussions and other activities. We will certainly talk about the problems associated with nitrates, the problems associated with lead service lines, the problems associated with this suite of chemicals in the PFAS family. But we're also going to be talking about the solutions. The solutions are there. We know what we need to do to address these challenges. All we have to do is have the will to do them. And so we're going to be talking about that, having those important, robust conversations, and getting us to the point where we're not only protecting the waters of Wisconsin, but addressing those challenges and fears of the tens of thousands of Wisconsinites that today, unfortunately, are not confident that they can turn on the tap and safely drink the water. So I look forward to those conversations over the next couple of months.
And with that, do any of you have any questions for our panelists today?
Hi, Laura Schulte with Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. As we've seen over the last year, in regards to legislation for PFAS especially, there's been a lot of pushback from industry. There's been pushback from lawmakers. We haven't seen a lot of success. You know, how are you guys working with lawmakers to get something like that passed for the protection of people drinking water?
Thank you for that question. The governor moved forward on a package relative to PFAS, and you're correct that the legislature didn't pass his budget, removing 11 FTEs for testing. So for us to determine where PFAS is, we needed those positions. So conversations are going on as we speak as to how can we now reorganize ourselves in such a way to get these tests done. And so while the legislature is still trying to understand the impacts, we have to go forward and figure out where PFAS is in drinking water. And we're going to make every effort to do that. The debates that go on around this, around the industry debates that goes on in the legislature are exactly that. They're just debates. I think, too, that industry doesn't wake up every day trying to poison a community, and nor does individuals in the legislature. We're going to get there. We're going to get there with the legislature, the governor, the people of the state of Wisconsin, and certainly industry, who, quite frankly, is more than willing to do their heavy lift. Now, while they do have concerns, they haven't shied away from being at the table with us. So the light is bright. Aside from politics, the light is bright about people wanting to participate in finding out where PFAS is, and more importantly, where it's not. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Along the same lines, I mean, Todd, you said you know what the solutions are, you know what you need to do. So I guess the question is, what's stopping you?
Whether in some cases, it depends on money. So in the case of lead service lines, we're continuing to make good progress, but we've need to bring more dollars to the table. There's a number of ways that can be achieved. Of course, the governor asked for additional funding in the budget that he didn't get, but there's ample discussion and money in the pending infrastructure bill at the federal level. If that can actually get through, we will have significant additional resources, not just here, but across the country to deal with lead service lines. On the nitrate side, there's a wide variety of things that can be done. Some of those involve the rulemaking effort that we are underway with to establish targeted performance standards in areas of the state where we have high nitrates and susceptible soils. But there's also a number of administrative things that can be done to address some of the nitrate issues, and certainly additional funding to deal with nitrates. Once again, the governor put a number of innovative ideas in the budget. We will continue to promote those and push them, and frankly, once again, there may be some opportunity to tap into some of those federal dollars for some of these purposes if we can get that infrastructure bill passed. And then on PFAS, you know, there's again the three categories of work that we've got to do: drinking water, surface water, and groundwater contamination. And I think the Action Council has laid out some excellent steps that can be taken. Again, some of them could have involved some legislative action. I continue to hope that there's separate legislation that will pass, the new version of the CLEAR Act that can address a number of these things. But part of it also is just administrative and reminding everybody, whether it's legislators and industry leaders, et cetera, you know, what triggered this work on the PFAS side is recommendations that came from the Department of Health Services, but they came from the Department of Health Services through our groundwater quality law. And this is, again, a law I referenced, passed in 1984, that we have used 138 times successfully to address the at that time, the emerging contaminant of the day that caused a lot of concern and fear in a wide variety of places, including the business community. So, but we did this for PCBs, we did it for mercury, we did it for toluene, benzene, atrazine, and every time, businesses were very concerned about what the impact was going to be on them, and every time we were able to do these and put these regulations in place in a way that addressed all of those concerns, and at the end of the day, the only thing left was a better protected environment. I'm absolutely confident that we can do that again with PFAS, and it's just going to take some work and some elbow grease and some additional conversations with all those affected entities.
Todd, can you talk a little bit about the timing of the drinking water and the groundwater proposals that are to go before the Natural Resources Board?
Yes, thanks, Secretary Cole. Again, there's three sets of rules, and a couple of them are still out where there's part of the rulemaking process. There's something called environmental impact or economic impact assessment. That's out for public comment for a couple of those. We are expecting to come into the Natural Resources Board this fall to first begin giving them an informational overview on where we are, but then coming through with our rule recommendations toward the end of the year to get in place in the early part of 2022.
You know, Laura mentioned some of the pushback that you encountered from either from the legislature or from industry. WMC is currently suing regarding some of the PFAS enforcement. Does the recent Supreme Court decision, or do the recent Supreme Court decisions in the two Clean Wisconsin versus DNR cases make you feel more confident in your legal ability to regulate based on the current statute?
Yes. Simply put, yes. I think that those are pivotal, those two decisions to our go-forward strategy. We got a ton of work to do, and we can't fall subject to the debates that go on in the legislature around these issues. We hear them, but we have work to do, and we, as Todd told you, that those rule packages are going to go before the board and later this year and begin to have those discussions in early 22. So, and those are long duration type processes, but we're going to start. And today's meeting codifies that we are not stepping away from PFAS, lead lateral removement, and nitrates in our drinking water, that we will continue to bang the drum and use whatever by every means necessary to protect human health around clean drinking water. So you are absolutely right. Those decisions were pivotal for us, and it was a boost for all of us dedicated to providing clean water to folks in the state of Wisconsin.
Todd or Preston, we do have a question from Danielle Kagan at WPR. She is asking, is the Safe Water for All campaign in response to Republican lawmakers who eliminated many proposals to address these issues under the 2-year budget that was recently enacted?
From Danielle. Hi, Danielle. Well, today is about us keeping in front of the public so that they too can be responsive in their own jurisdictions and ask the tough questions of their own cities, towns, and villages. Our work isn't response to what's going on in the legislature, as I said before. It's what's going on in our communities around the state of Wisconsin. In the last month, we've had another community tip relative to PFAS in their drinking water in La Crosse and certainly in French Island. Rhinelander, Peshtigo, Marinette, Dane County. That's what's keeping the fire burning in our gut around clean drinking water. And Todd gave an eloquent diagnosis of where we've been on clean drinking water. It's just who we are. It's who this agency is and who this legislature is and who this governor is. While their politics will be their politics, we have work to do as agency officials to make sure that we keep clean water in front of everybody.
Go ahead, Lauren.
One of the provisions in ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, was that some money coming to states could be used for clean drinking water. Is that something you've asked Governor Evers about? Something that he's indicated could be possible with that money coming to Wisconsin?
Todd's the money guy.
Yeah, it's certainly something we've talked with the governor's office about. There's a number of things in play. Of course, they've got significant challenges, pressures on them in terms of where that money can be used and how it could be used. Frankly, the other issue is that now that the money coming from the feds under that act for Wisconsin is split into two payments. There's a chunk of money this year, and then there's another chunk of money next year. So that's another issue. And then, frankly, the other thing that everybody's aware of is that while there are some eligibility opportunities under the Rescue Act, if the infrastructure bill passes, it is front and center. Funding for water infrastructure and addressing issues like this is front and center in that legislation. And that's where the real opportunity for significant federal dollars to address these issues. So I think a number of us are continuing to hope that the federal government will do the right thing on that infrastructure bill, because that's where I think we've really got the opportunities to provide some significant dollars from the federal level.
Yeah, and think about it this way, whether the legislature is waiting to see what the feds do, we have to do our work too, and they have to do their work in the state as well in codifying rules associated with clean water. But there's a bright light around the ARPA funding, the infrastructure funding. Remember the ARA funds, the American Recovery Act that the Obama administration put in play. We have shovel-ready projects. We have things that we know that we can get done. We just need the funding. And should it come from the citizens of the state relative to through the legislature or through the federal government, we're ready with projects. And as you heard from our team, they know where we're going. We just need some money.
Is that it? Chris? All right, well, as you guys see on the boards, we have the Safe Water for All panel series that is coming up, that is included in the press release that you should all have now. If not, you can reach out to us. Those dates are to be determined, but they will kick off in August. So stay tuned for more information on that. Otherwise, if you have any follow-up questions, please email us at dnrpress@wisconsin.gov. Other than that, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, folks, for coming. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.
Take care.